Hello, this is Lance from the Crawlspace Media Network. I really hope you're enjoying one of our fine programs right now. While I have your ear, I want to tell you about another quality show on the network. It's called Pi Rational Stories, and it's our first fictional podcast. There is a space between reality and fantasy, between rational and irrational. In this space, there are stories of obsession and the dark side of human nature, of love and despair, and glimmers of hope. These are anthology-style stories narrated by the finest voices in the industry and written in a dark corner of the universe. So if you like well-told tales, listen and subscribe to Pi Rational Stories. That's PI_Rational Stories on Spotify, Apple, or your preferred listening app. And now, back to the program.
You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victim's advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
That makes me Bill Thomas. Lots of really interesting things going on in our world. We were very excited to see the Carla Walker case. An arrest has been made in this case. This is a 1974 cold case that our friends at Othram Labs played a key role in identifying DNA in Carla's murder. This is a case you hopefully have read about. We'll include links in our show notes. Carla and her boyfriend were attacked while sitting outside a bowling alley where they had stopped after a Valentine's Day dance in February 1974. Suspects were identified after Carla's body was found. She had been held for several days after essentially being kidnapped. Her boyfriend was pistol whipped, and the assailant fired his weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, but it didn't strike the boyfriend. He was left unconscious in the car, and Carla disappeared. Very sadly, her body was found a few days later. Law enforcement looked at hundreds of suspects, including the man who was arrested a couple of days ago now, keeping in mind that forensic advancements were not particularly great in 1974. They actually spoke to this man whom they arrested back in 74. He was on the short list of suspects because he owned a .22 Ruger pistol, which was the type of gun that they were looking for, and he was a registered owner. When they met with him, he claimed the weapon had been stolen 6 weeks earlier. How convenient, which is right around the time that Carla Walker was murdered. This man had a limited criminal history. He had been arrested for car theft. He'd spent some time in prison. But at the time of the murders, he was married, making a living as a truck driver. He happened to have the night off the evening that Carla Walker was abducted, and the next day off, he was also not assigned to work. He was always on the short list, but they were unable to prove that he was involved. Othram got the assignment to take a look at the evidence after other forensic labs had failed to identify DNA. So real props to David Middleman and the team down there. And they were able to extract DNA from her bra. Then they did what they call full genome sequencing. This is real state-of-the-art forensics. This is even significantly higher full DNA profile, much better than what's currently being used in the CODIS system. So they were able to go back to law enforcement with a family name and an identity, which they had found through their genealogical searches, and said, you're looking for someone with this last name. And there were 3 men that fit that profile. They arrested this man just the other day, and he has confessed. So this will not even be going to trial. Very, very exciting outcome to a tragic case. Kristin, you and I were talking about the fact that the boyfriend was looked at very, very hard back in 74 as a suspect, and how awful that would be.
We were also mentioning the fact that due to the very serious nature, the gravity and the violence of the crime, we very highly doubt that this was his first foray into violent crime. It just doesn't seem terribly likely to us.
No, he held her for several days. He apparently tortured her and raped her and then murdered her and dumped her body near a lake outside of town. I have a real hard time believing that this guy wasn't involved in other serious crimes, but we'll have to see how the rest of the case unfolds.
And if you would like to help the good folks at Othram work on cases such as these, there are a couple of ways that you can help. You can contribute financially if you have the means, or you can contribute your DNA to DNAsolves.com. If you are looking for information on some of the other cases that they are currently working on, you can go to their social media sites. Again, DNAsolves.com, and take a look at some of the other cases that they are currently trying to fund. We have been talking to you guys about Durham Jane Doe, and her case is still in need of funding, as are a couple of new cases that are on the list, a baby doe in Colombia and a young man outside of Galveston. So if you are so inclined, please do take a moment to go to DNAsolves.com and take a look, and then contribute if you can. We thank you in advance if you can.
And speaking of homework, we want to once again thank you for your ratings and reviews. They mean a great deal to us. Strong ratings and reviews help us grow our podcast. So we really appreciate it if you can take the time to go to your favorite podcast platform and give us a 5-star review. We also wanted to thank our new monthly supporters. We've added a new mechanism at our Anchor site where you can find the home site for our podcast, Mind Over Murder. We wanted to thank our first batch of supporters, Mary, Mona, Ellen, Mariola, and Amanda, all of whom have signed up for this new program. You can contribute anywhere from 99 cents a month up to $14.99 a month if you're feeling flush to help support the work that we do here at Mind Over Murder, and we very much appreciate your support.
Thank you so much. We are looking forward to presenting to you the first of 2 episodes with retired cold case detective Thomas Holsinger from Henrico County. He's going to talk to us more about the Donna Hall, Mike Margaret murder case. Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you again soon. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And today we are joined by retired Detective Thomas Holsinger of the Henrico County Police Department to talk to us about the Donna Hall and Mike Margaret murder case. Detective Holsinger, welcome to Mind Over Murder.
Thank you. It's great to be with you guys.
I know we were teasing you a little bit off the air about the fact that you're retired, but you're actually still a young man mid-career. It's not like you're sitting on your porch somewhere sipping iced teas, right?
Right. I retired from the public, I guess, sector of law enforcement with Henrico County and have moved on to a private college in the Shenandoah Valley and kind of doing everything for them in the law enforcement world.
Well, fantastic. We really appreciate you being here.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about your professional background, please. We're very interested.
Well, let's see. I studied at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, VCU. Then I went up to Harrisonburg Police for 2 years and then went back to Henrico County and finished out my 25 years down in Henrico. And my last 17 were in the homicide section, and then the last 3 I was moved over to the cold case unit, looking over old homicides and so forth.
Now, is that something you were always interested in and aspired to? In other words, it sounds like you've spent the bulk of your law enforcement career working homicide. That was something that you had aspired to?
Kind of drifted that way. When a police officer starts out, everybody goes on the road and works uniform patrol, that type of thing. And I did that in Henrico for 3 years, but I wasn't a big ticket writer, I guess you'd say. And I like more of the criminal aspect of it, different things like that. I didn't like writing tickets and so forth. So
should we all thank you for that?
I guess so. You know, when you run radar and you stop people going to work for speed, and I was like, well, at least they're going to work and so forth. So,
but they weren't too excited. They weren't too excited to see you.
No. And most officers, they find themselves, they're either traffic oriented or they're criminal oriented. And I was on the criminal oriented side. So it wasn't long after 3 years, they moved me into detective division and I started doing detective work.
And then tell us a little bit about Henrico. How big an area is it? How broad a geographic area for those of us like me who don't live in Virginia?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Henrico is kind of a strange geographical county. It's a suburb of Richmond, and it kind of wraps around the north part of Richmond. So you're on the east end, you're on the west end, and you're on the north side. And then below Richmond is Chesterfield County, which is another county below. So Richmond sits in the middle, and Henrico kind of goes around it.
And so it encompasses suburban as well as rural districts?
Yes, Henrico has the West End, which is kind of called Short Pump. It's a lot of residential areas, a lot of shopping centers, that type of thing. The East End was traditionally more farmland, the regional airports in the East End. But the East End, in my years down there, has grown now to where it's becoming more residential now.
And how did the Donna Hall and Mike Margaret murder come onto your radar? Where were you when you heard about it? Give us some details on that, if you would, please.
Well, it actually, I went to school with Mike Margaret. I graduated from Tucker High School in 1984, and Mike graduated in 1984 from Tucker. He was originally, I believe, supposed to graduate in 82, but had been set back a year or two, and then he graduated in 84 and actually was in some of my classes. I didn't know Mike personally, but I knew his brother Scott real well, but Mike was in some of my classes.
So you were living in the area when the murders took place in 1984?
I was. We had graduated again from Tucker High School in June of 84, and Mike was murdered in August of 84. So I was still in the area. Of course, everybody heard about this, and we all knew Mike and everything. Donna Hall went to our rival high school at the time, which was next door, which was Freeman High School. And a lot of people certainly knew Donna. And so we kind of took in people from both high schools when this happened. Everybody kind of knew what had happened. Nobody, of course, knew what happened because it went unsolved for so many years. When I became a police officer, I knew about the murders for years and years, but it wasn't until cold case when I went in and started cracking the books and reading all the case file and learning all the different things that were going on in the case. And that's how it kind of got started.
You know, that had to have been such a shock for your community. What was your initial response when you heard that this had happened to your friend, your colleague?
Yeah, it was a shock. Everybody kind of talked about it. As years went on, they didn't talk too much about it. A lot of different rumors were flying around on what had happened and what was going on. Back in those days, I didn't really look into it that much or didn't, ask too many questions about it. I was young, going to VCU and doing my own thing. And then once I started reading the case files, so many names and so many different people started coming back to me. And, we just started learning, this is what was going on. The original detective was Jim Dorton. He's a fabulous detective, and he did a lot of work on the case. So it was real interesting reading his stuff.
And had you worked with Dorton prior to his retirement? Your careers overlap.
They did. He was, of course, in homicide. When I started out as a detective, I was a burglary. Everybody starts out kind of like a burglary detective. I would work, in different offices, but we certainly saw each other. We knew each other real well. And he was one of those detectives that you're like, I want to be like that guy. And he was so professional and so thorough. And, as a young detective, you really would model yourself after somebody like him. But he was real thorough, and he did a fabulous job on the case to start with.
So when you went and looked back at the work that he had done, did you just immediately pick right back up again where he left off, or did you feel like you needed to go back and reinvestigate anything, or like how did you follow up on the work that he had done?
Well, some of the work he had done, as a as a kid back in the 80s, I had heard stories about what had happened. And I saw where Jim Dorton had gone back and looked at those theories and different things and had discounted them. And it was like, okay, that's how he eliminated that. There was all these different stories and the stories of different people involved. And he had actually made contact with those people, and he had done things to eliminate those people from being involved. And it was, it's kind of eye-opening when you read those things. And then, yes, you pick up from the things that he was looking at, and you just carried it on. Now, unfortunately, Jim Dorton was working on it in the 80s. I'm working on it in 2014. So technology has gone like umpteen-fold. So I had the ability to use technology where he didn't have that, namely like DNA and different things like that.
Yeah, this, for the benefit of our listeners, we always have to remind folks, when we're talking about a murder like Donna and Mike's in 1984, DNA hasn't even made its way out of the lab yet. And so it's not widely used in criminal investigations for a number of years. And so in the Jim Dorton era, he's working a case from a very different kind of scientific perspective.
Yeah, and I've told other media outlets, and I've told other people, in my experience of working just the regular homicides when I was in the rotation for 17 years, a murder like this would probably be solved in 48 hours. Just the technology with the phones, the cell towers, the different camera systems, different things that you can utilize. Yeah, a case like this would have been solved in 48 hours.
It's funny because when I speak to young people about the Colonial Parkway murders, which started in 1986 and ran to 1989, sometimes when I'm speaking to groups of college students or folks that are in programs at schools and universities, they look at me like I've come back in time, because I'm talking about, people will say, well, was there video surveillance footage? Well, there weren't a lot of video cameras in the 80s. Why didn't they call for help? Well, back then you didn't have this thing called a cell phone, and on and on and on. And, I recognize that I'm older than the college students that I'm speaking to. Your career actually overlaps these advances in terms of moving forensics and other techniques forward.
Oh, yeah. And, just the cell phone, it's one of those, when you get to a murder scene, it might have been the first thing you did was go to the body, where when I got to the murder scene, I didn't really care too much about the body, not to sound insensitive. I wanted the phone that was laying on the ground. And we would immediately take the phone and go back and forensically dump everything out of the phone. We would find out what the closest cell tower was. We would dump the cell tower. Later on, they would tell me about the body, but it was the cell phone. And you can imagine the way you live off your cell phone, everything's in there. Everybody you're talking to, everything that's going on. And with the Margaret Hall case, you're dealing with more of a drug robbery aspect. So that phone is completely important if it was nowadays.
Mm-hmm. It's a fantastic observation about how different things are. We've talked about this on the show, too. People seem to not think about this very much. Your cell phone's actually tracking your every move and pinging off cell towers, and can give law enforcement or other people with that capability a strong sense of where you've been, and then, of course, who you've been talking to, what you've been looking at on the internet, and so on. Those kind of histories are available to you now, but this obviously isn't the case in 1984. So in a case like this, as Kristin was saying, coming up to speed, where do you start?
Right. And back then, Jim would have started with like a victimology. That's what we usually called it. You start talking to the people closest to the victim, and you work your way out, and those people will lead you in certain directions. And again, Jim's dealing with people who are actively in the drug world, actively using drugs, actively selling drugs, and they're not all that forthcoming with him and so forth. And when I was doing it in 2014, in 2015, and 2016, I put out there originally, I'm not interested in drugs. It's part of the case. I'm not looking to get anybody in trouble or anything like that. I just want the honesty. I'm looking for the murderer. So I had a lot of calls from people who felt confident with that and just, told me everything. Yeah, I sold drugs. I did this. I did that. I knew them from this way. And so I had my pool of people was a little bit better than what Jim had to deal with back in the 80s because nobody told him the truth.
And were people accepting of your word that, look, I'm not interested in some drug deal from 1984. I'm interested in what happened to these two young people? Did people accept that and trust you?
They did, and some did not. That was probably the funny part about some of this was there was people that completely accepted it and told me everything, real cooperative. And then there was people that I would learn that they were a huge drug dealer in the time. And even 30 years later, never wanted to admit to selling me or selling a bag of weed. And I would say, hey, buddy, I've got, umpteen people that say you did this. Again, I could care less. I'm just trying to establish what was going on. They would, to this day, would still lie to you about it 30 years later.
I know we've got a wide group of people, a wide circle that Donna and Mike moved in. Without getting too terribly much into specifics, like how many people ultimately did you end up talking to during this investigation? Can you give us some idea of numbers here?
Shoo, it was a lot. To be honest with you, I couldn't give you a number, but it was over 100, and especially when the Facebook page started, I found myself working and getting this information and going on. The phone just kept ringing, and before I knew it, it was like 9:00 at night, and I was kind of like, I've got to get out of here and get something to eat. But, people were still calling. I think eventually it got to the point where they were leaving me so many messages and so forth that it was taking me about 2 days to get back to all these people. But wow. I stayed constantly on the phone just talking to people. So it was a tremendous amount, especially after the Facebook page took off.
Is it your sense that most people want this solved?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of people that really want this solved. And of course, I've got to give credit out to Blue, Rob, Chris, and Tim. They're the ones that really kind of set up the Facebook page. And I think it went from like when they first set it up, there might have been like 50 people on it or something. And then like a week later, it was already up to 1,700. And then, like a couple of days later, it was, I forgot how many people finally joined it, but it was over, 1,000 and some people.
Yeah, I think it's in the 3,000 range. We'll double check that. It's grown exponentially, and more people are joining now again because of this new information about the case. So when you got involved, how did you find out about the Facebook page?
I'm not sure how it started. I don't know if it was either Blue, Chris, or Tim or Rob who kind of posed the question of doing it. I know Facebook, but I didn't, know how to start a page or anything like that. And they had mentioned starting it, and they went ahead and did it. It might have been Rob, because Rob's big with the Freeman alumni, and I think he just rolled it off of a Freeman alumni group and started its own page. And then I started monitoring, but it was so active at one point. We had criminal analysts. I worked for Henrico Police, and we were lucky to have a lot of resources. Henrico has a lot of resources. It was a team effort. It just wasn't me. There was a group of criminal analysts that were assigned to me. They were looking at it, and they would come in like every 15 minutes. Did you check the page? Did you see that? And I'm like, no. And
wow.
Oh my God, get on the page. Look at this. Look at this. And they started tracking everything. And in the meantime, I'm still trying to interview all these people, and they're following the page and so forth. And I also worked with Joe Shield. He was a retired homicide guy that was in the cold case unit with me. And between the two of us, it kept us busy all the time, just going over things.
To that point in your career, had you encountered a Facebook page being used in this manner to help forward a criminal investigation?
No, not really, because when you work active homicides, the media is not your friend. And so When I was in the rotation working active homicides, I tried to keep everything I could from the media. When you get moved to cold case, the media is now your friend, and to get the information, you need to work through the media for them to draw it in. And actually, when I got transferred to cold case in 2014, obviously it was the 30th anniversary of Mike and Donna's death. So the Facebook page got started, like we talked about how all these people joined it and so forth. Well, the media picks up on, I guess, all those clicks and likes and different things. And the next thing I know, all 3 TV stations in Richmond were wanting to do stories on it. And so when August rolled around, we did some functions with the local TV stations and got the word out, which generated more calls and more information.
On some level, and this happened to us in the Colonial Parkway Murders a few years ago when we had our 30th anniversary, some of what's generated is repetitive. In other words, it's ground that has been well covered. How do you handle situations like that when people are coming to you with information that, quite frankly, you already know?
That was difficult because just like me as a kid, everybody had heard these same old stories about what happened. And in cold case, you kind of release more information. When you work in active cases, you don't say too much. But again, in cold case, you kind of release that's been looked at. And I would try to explain how it got discounted or how things... I had to release more information. It's been 30 years and a little transparency helped me.
Mm-hmm.
Did people generally respond well to that? Like when they provided you with information and you had to shut them down kind of politely?
Yes and no. Some people said, oh, okay, and they accepted it. Some people didn't accept it and, kind of wanted to argue with it a little bit. And you just kind of went, well, thanks for the information and so forth. But you're right. There was a lot of repetitive, you might get off the phone and the last 3 people you talked to all said the same thing. And you have to explain to them that, that didn't happen.
So there has to be a certain amount of dispelling misinformation to kind of see your way clear to common ground or correct ground, it sounds like.
I did. I ended up releasing more and more information of the case, which normally you probably wouldn't release in a case. And at the time, I was working 2 different angles. I'm working the Facebook with the interviews, the personal contact, and then the second avenue I was working was trying to get this evidence into a lab because I ultimately knew that to bring a prosecution, a case to the Commonwealth Attorney, I'm going to need something scientifically to bring forward along with all these interviews.
Yeah, you've talked about that a little bit, that there's an expectation now on the part of juries when you present cases that you're going to be able to back this up scientifically. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. A murder case is great when you have the forensic science to go with you. If you've got the DNA, if you've got the fingerprints, if you've got the cell phone information, or you've got something scientifically to bring into the case, then that's great. If all you're dealing with is people picking somebody out of a lineup, just people's interviews, different things like that, and you don't have anything to back it up, a good prosecutor is going to explain to a jury that sometimes murder cases are built on good old-fashioned police work and not necessarily the CSI factor. And, obviously the prosecutor doesn't have to go into that if he has all that with him. But if he doesn't have all that and you're dealing with what humans are seeing and what they're doing, then they're going to have to go into that CSI factor in their initial stages with the jury.
And they need to explain this to a group of average citizens they have to develop a significant understanding of the case and whatever evidence you're putting forward. So I would imagine that partnership with the prosecutor is pretty pivotal.
Oh yeah, you work with the prosecutor real close from the start of the case. The Commonwealth Attorney will assign somebody to the case or themselves. If it's a high-profile case, they usually take the case themselves. But you work with them every day, and they do. Every jury is expecting that DNA. They're expecting the video of it. They're expecting the fingerprint.
If and when this case were ever to go to trial, which Commonwealth Attorney, which office would handle a case like Donna and Mike's?
Well, it would be the Henrico County Commonwealth Attorney. every now and then the facts of the case can bleed over to a federal violation, which you could bring in the U.S. attorney. But most of the time, a state or local Commonwealth attorney is going to handle a murder case.
You mentioned the science, and there's been some discussion on the Facebook group that are supporting Mike and Donna that there have been problems in moving the testing forward. I know there are limits on what you can say. Can you tell us a little bit about what's gone on and where we ran into glitches regarding getting the evidence in Donna and Mike's case tested?
Sure. And that was probably the most frustrating part when I was working the case for 3 years. And a lot of misinformation was out there in the public. Like we had a DNA sample. Let's test it against so-and-so. Let's test it against this. And, it was never that way. When they got the case in the 80s, there is a third blood type in the crime scene. So obviously you have Mike and you have Donna, and you've got a third blood type there. And at the time, DNA was not as good as it is now. And they, years later, tested. The sample wasn't large enough. If you can imagine, back in the 80s or the early 90s, you had to have a good sample to DNA tests, where nowadays you don't even need anything, something that's almost invisible. They even have touch DNA now. So, they always knew, we have 2 sets of bloody clothes, one of Donna, one of Mike, and on those clothes at the time, there was a third blood type, and the cause of death is a knifing. So in most stabbing cases, the assailant usually cuts himself and so forth. And we were trying to get the state lab to re-examine the clothes and so forth. And we were kind of running into a dead end, and they didn't want to do it.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. In these stressful times, everyone needs some time to chill out and relax. That's why we're excited to announce this week's sponsor, Boston Green Health.
Boston Green Health is a local provider of CBD products that specializes in oils, topicals, gummies, and edibles. Boston Green Health's plant-based products can provide natural relief and rest for the mind, body, and soul.
As one of New England's premier hemp-based companies, they offer a variety of all-natural CBD products that use a blend of locally sourced hemp extract.
Visit bostongreenhealth.com for premium CBD oil, a delicious variety of CBD-infused gummies, luxurious handcrafted topicals, and a product line for pets.
Mind Over Murder listeners can receive 20% off any purchase by using show code MOM20.
Boston Green Health takes pride in being New England's most trusted CBD brand.
Visit bostongreenhealth.com and use show code MOM20 for 20% off any purchase. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And we kept pushing and pushing. And that was the second avenue I was working on. The first avenue, of course, is interviewing all these people. And then the second avenue, which people really didn't know what I was working, was trying to get these clothes into a lab to be examined.
Any idea why they didn't want to test?
You know, you hate to say it's something budgetary, but, you know, most things come down to money. And I don't know, you know, at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of forensic. I don't know if they were just really busy. They didn't have enough examiners. Cold cases are always pushed to the back in front of, you know, active cases. And I got that, and you know, and I explained it, but we met several times, and I have to say that Hum Cardinal was the chief. He's recently retired, but he came in to be the chief, and Hum actually went to Freeman, and he knows everybody. You know, I had a great working relationship with the chief, and you know, at one point we had looked at going the private route, which we would say, let's take the clothes, let's take the evidence, and let's go to a lab in Fairfax, and we'll pay them and have them look into it. And Hum was 100% behind it. He said, well, let me go talk to the people at the lab to tell them that we're going to do that. And he went down, he spoke to them, and they were working on a new cold case type section. I'm not real familiar what they were going to do, but they said it was going to be up and running in about 4 months, and whether we wanted to hold off. And we all met. I called Scott and Margaret. Scott Margaret's I think the only living relative, close relative of both Mike and Donna.
There may be a sister as well, but I've talked to Scott in the last couple of years. He seems more active. I think there's
You're right.
half sister. I don't think she's as directly involved, but very supportive.
Right. And you're right. And I did talk to her at one point. So we talked to Scott and we said, do you want to wait 4 months? And Hum was like, if you want to send it to the private lab, Henrico will send it to the private lab. And I said, well, you know, we've waited 30 years. What's another 4 months to have the state lab do it? And everybody agreed. We were really transparent with Scott about most everything that was going on. And so we waited, and I know how the government works. And it's like, if they're telling you 4 months, it might be 6 months or 8 months. So when the 4 months hit, we reapproached. Well, we're not ready yet. Okay, 8 months plan. You know, they're not ready. And before you know it, they keep pushing it off. And hindsight, I wish we had just sent it to the lab in Fairfax from the get-go. And, you know, it's just one of those things. And I don't know what their reason was. I don't know if it was budgetary. They didn't want to do something. But I'm sure as a forensic examiner, when you get 2 full sets of bloody clothes and you already know that there was a third blood type on there, you're going to find something, and especially today's DNA world. So the evidence sat, and that avenue for me kind of dried up. And before you knew it, it was getting close to when I was going to retire and so forth. But it's still there. It's still ready to go. And it's just a matter of getting it in there.
I'm not looking to rub salt in that wound, but my understanding is that the state lab promised Henrico PD that if you waited, your evidence in the Hall Margaret case would be the first to use their new system. Am I right?
Well, I wasn't part of that meeting, but yes, that's my recollection of what I was told from that meeting as well. And I think when they were revealing this new cold case section, it was actually the person who revealed it really wasn't supposed to reveal they're going to have this up and running in 4 to 6 months. Yes, that's my understanding, is they were told that your evidence will be the first to go in.
And yet they've actually never conducted the tests.
Yeah, well, Yeah, I've been gone for 3 years now, and my understanding is that it has never been tested. And again, it's still sitting there. I pulled it out. I've looked at it, and the only thing they tested it. They took some samples off of it back early. I don't have my notes, but early 2000s or something, and they just didn't have enough sample back then to develop a profile. The whole thing is you want to develop a profile on a blood type that's on there.
Right. And to be fair to everyone, and you kind of referenced this, and we've learned this in the Colonial Parkway murders as well, some of the tests actually consume the evidence. In other words, at the end of the process, hopefully you have additional information about who the perpetrator might be, but the blood or semen or saliva or whatever it is may actually be gone.
Oh, sure. And that's what happened in this case. It was tested twice for DNA, and eventually, as you test a sample, you consume the sample, and the sample was consumed. Now, we do have the information on the sample, like the blood type or whatever, but that was easy to type back in the 80s. But through testing, the sample was consumed. Now, hindsight being what it is, it's, if you knew in the 2000s at some point that you were going to be able to find out, you just don't touch the sample. But that's playing Monday morning quarterback.
No one could have told you or anybody else back in the early 2000s that there would be testing that would be so refined in 2020 that it would use such a minuscule amount of evidence that, a drop of blood would be more than enough, for example, to conduct testing, whereas not that many years ago, things like the drops of blood, which are visible in some of the crime scene photographs in the Jeep, those drops of blood literally no longer exist.
Right. And even in my career of working, murders, in my first year, you would have a certain amount of droplets and you would look, is that going to be enough? To when I finished my career, we were testing stuff that was invisible. So, it was, like on guns and so forth, you can get the DNA right off of a gun and there's no blood. You
referenced touch DNA, which can you explain a little bit about how touch DNA works?
Well, from a layman's point, I guess if you found if you found a gun laying next to a body or in the woods or somewhere like that, you obviously would take the gun in and you swab it and you pull off. You're not seeing it with your eyes, but you're pulling material off the gun that you don't even see. And then they are putting into the DNA lab. And I'll get into an area I have no idea how they do it, but they end up replicating things and producing enough of the evidence to create a DNA profile.
Right. And we've read that and heard from other detectives that even in a situation with bullet fragments, if someone loaded the gun, that touch DNA can even survive not just on the cartridge, but sometimes even on the shell as it moved forward. So the technology is so much more advanced now than it was even 5 or 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Now, I've never had that. And of course, you're dealing with a projectile with the heat and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I have, in my cases, I have had DNA on the cartridge casing.
Right.
Where, you used to fingerprint cartridge casings and so forth. Well, actually, nowadays, it's more important to swab the casing for DNA than it is for the fingerprints on the cartridge casing.
Yeah. It's funny, as cool as fingerprinting is, it begins to feel a little old school detective show like we watched when we were kids.
Right.
I want to press on this state lab thing, though, because I'm disturbed. These conversations that you and Chief Cardinal and others had with the state lab, how many years ago are we talking about?
Well, initially when we got the case, that was in 2014. That was probably when I first started wanting those examined, and we went down there and met several times. I believe Chief Cardinal's meeting might have been in 2015, somewhere in there, when we decided that, hey, listen, they're not really listening to us. Let's take it to a private lab. And private labs have become more prevalent, I guess, with DNA and different things. My understanding, I don't know this for a fact or anything, but I think the Virginia lab even contracts out to these private labs when their workload is overwhelming and they have to get things done. They'll contract out. In my understanding, the lab we were looking to send it to is one of those labs that the state lab would contract out to. And I'm probably ruffling some feathers by talking about this all, but that was the most frustrating thing out of the whole thing, because everybody wanted to know certain things. Of course, I did too, and I'm working the way, and the lab was just not giving us the attention that I wanted.
Well, as the brother of a murder victim, I'm going to weigh in here. I'm troubled by this. What we're saying is that the Commonwealth of Virginia State Forensics Lab did not keep the promises that they made to the Henrico Police Department. Am I correct?
That's my understanding. It wasn't a promise made directly to me or anything, but that's my understanding of once this program got up and running, we would be the first to do it. And we even, I even talked with Scott Margaret about the delay, and we all came to the agreement. Well, we've come this far. Why not wait to let the state lab do that?
And you were saying in retrospect, if you could do it all over again, and I know hindsight's 20/20 and all those cliches, if you could do it all over again, would you have waited or would you have gone with a private DNA lab?
Oh, no, absolutely. Gone with the private lab. I would have sent that stuff off. Now, like I talk about a team effort, I had forensics people that we were all working the case together. So not only was I the one talking, the forensic investigators for Henrico were also trying to get this in as well.
Yeah, you've talked about those partnerships quite a bit with the analysts looking at the information coming in from various sources and your forensics partners working on the scientific side while you're working sort of on the people side trying to put the story together. Is that a fair characterization?
Absolutely. I couldn't imagine working a homicide case nowadays without the obviously the forensics people, but the criminal analysts as well. They're the real heroes in the background they're going over the cell phone records. They're going over the different things, and you're kind of running around like a chicken with the head cut off, dealing with,
it's not that bad, is it?
Yeah. Well, you're briefing the command staff, you're briefing this, you're briefing them, you're getting all this information thrown to you, and then they're the ones that are really digging into the work, and then they're grabbing you saying, hey, we got this guy's cell phone records on the murder phone, or we've got this, we've got that. And then you have to stop all of a sudden and listen intently to what they're telling you. And it breaks the case wide open. And yeah, the forensic analysts are the ones, and there was several of them, they were just monitoring that Facebook page, and they were coming to me left and right. Did you see the page? Did you see what so-and-so wrote? And I'm like, what?
Oh, that's actually pretty cool.
Yeah. And I will tell you this is real funny too. It's this is how this case really hit home with Henrico. Was the main criminal analyst at the time of the murder was a dispatcher and took the call when they found Mike and Donna.
Oh, wow.
So in 1984, this lady was a dispatcher on the 911 call when they found Mike and Donna. And here she is 30 years later working that case.
Wow.
So, she would stay late. She was doing everything. She was making me calls on weekends. And, that was unbelievable.
So I know that a lot of people consider DNA to be the silver bullet in a case like this, but can you see this case being solved in any other way if, for some reason or another, the forensics and the lab testing do not work out?
Not really, unless, you never want to say 100% any which way, but I think I had talked to Bill before about this, and it was, we took so much information from people on the Facebook page, the interviews and so forth. I have the story. I just don't know what story it is. But if we got the DNA done and I was able to get something back forensically, you're kind of working the case backwards. And so it's like, if I had this person's DNA on that scene, I could say, oh yeah, okay, this is the story. And you're kind of working it backwards, where normally you might get a case and they call you, a week later and say, when you're working murders, they do your DNA right away. If you're working a burglary, you're lucky to get it back in 6 months. So on a murder case, they work your DNA fairly quickly, and they might call in and say, person A is the one who's on the DNA profile. Okay, and then you put the story together. On this case, I think I've got the story. I just don't know the player.
That's got to be incredibly frustrating.
Yes, it is.
If you had to narrow down, I mean, we've worked with detectives in our case, and they talk about, well, no one's ever really truly eliminated until, a final correct suspect is identified. But they said that you have people on the short list and on the long list. And the long list is everybody who ever touched this case who's potentially a suspect. If you had to narrow it down to a number, how many people do you think would be on the short list of people that you'd like to take another hard look at in the Donna Hall, Mike Margaret murder?
Maybe 4, 5, right around that many. Taking all the interviews into account, all the different work we did. And a lot of people were mentioned at the beginning, but Jim Dorton did a great job eliminating a lot of those. I would get down to about 4 people, 5 people.
Wow.
Wow.
That says a lot. So here you are, you've talked to hundreds of people and looked at every potential suspect of whom you're aware, and you're now down to 4 or 5. Now the case ultimately would be handed off to another detective, correct? Because you're doing other things.
Right. Yeah. And, Henrico for a long time has always had a cold case unit, which is great. It's a great resource to have. Other agencies try to work their cold cases in with active detectives. You can't do that. You have to have a seasoned detective who is, been doing it for years, and they are able to give 100% of their time to a cold case, not in an active rotation. And what was the other part of your question? Because there was something else I really wanted to touch on too that you had said.
Well, there's the handoff that's required between yourself as someone who is cycling out of the department.
Right. And that's how I came into the department, because Joe Shield was the cold case detective. And I was lucky enough to, when I rotated in, they continued to keep Joe there and asked Joe to stay on part-time, and Joe did that. And so it was kind of a seamless transition there. And again, with Henrico's resources, it was just great to have all that. And again, I'm sure Chief English will be the same way, but Hum was awesome. He was a great chief to work for. We would meet with him once a month to keep him updated on everything we were doing and so forth. And he was real supportive of us.
Join us again next time as we continue our conversation with retired Detective Thomas Holsinger of the Henrico Police Department as we explore the Donna Hall, Mike Margaret case. Thanks for listening to Mind Over Murder.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.